Hope you are well and surviving these unusual times. Let us put it that way. These unusual times. I wanted to talk this morning in the Torah class about a theme as opposed to a specific verse. And it's a theme that threads its way through the Torah in general, and also obviously through the parsha that we are reading in particular. So first, let me begin by just situating us in the story where we are. So we right now are in the second parsha of the Torah, of Shemot, of the book of Exodus, Parshat Pharaoh. And this parsha is in the midst, in the thick of the Exodus story. And it reminds us what is going on from both sides. That is, from the Israelite side, there is, of course, this both fear and anticipation, because now they see around them the wonders and signs that God is working. And of course, on the Egyptian side, there is the continual concern and growing concern about what's happening in their country and around them. But what I want to start off with is at the beginning of Vayera, when God comes to Moses and gives him his mission to go to Israel and to tell them, to go to Pharaoh and to go to Israel and to tell them that liberation is coming. And so we come to chapter 6, which is going to be the focus of our interest this morning, at least for a while. And in chapter 6, what you see is, let's start with verse 2. Why not? Why should we abbreviate God's words? Okay, let's remind ourselves this is God speaking to Moses, telling him what to say when he goes to the Israelites. I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but I did not make myself known to them by my name. And then it's the tetragrammaton in English, the 4 letters, Yud Kei Vav Kei, and usually rendered in Hebrew as Adonai. In other words, Moses is going to see a different aspect of God, and the Israelites will, from that which the forefathers saw. That is a much discussed verse, as you can imagine. What aspect of God is Moses seeing that others have not? But we're going to leave that aside for the moment and instead move on. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they lived as sojourners. In other words, when Abraham lived in Canaan, he lived there not as an owner of the land. It wasn't his land. He was just a sojourner in it. Then it says, I have now heard the moaning of the Israelites because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage. So now God understands, or is relating to the slavery of the Israelites, and has heard their cry and is going to save them. And it says, say therefore to the Israelite people, I am the Lord. Now this is what Moses is supposed to say to the Israelites. I am the Lord. I will free you from the labors of the Egyptians and deliver you from their bondage. I'll redeem you with an outstretched arm and through extraordinary chastisements. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I, the Lord, am your God, who freed you from the labors of the Egyptians. I'll bring you to the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, give it to you for a possession, I, the Lord. Okay? So, understand what God has said. God says through Moses to the Israelites, I will take you from the land and bring you in. I will take you from Egypt, liberate you, and bring you into the land of Israel. What is interesting about this is that Moses then says to God, what? When Moses told the Israelites they wouldn't listen to Moses, their spirits crushed by cruel bondage. So Moses says that to the Israelites, but then, interestingly, or predictably, or remarkably, the Israelites don't listen to him. They can't hear him. And the question is, why can't the Israelites hear the message that they're going to be liberated? When it says they're crushed by cruel bondage, kotzer ruach is the word that is used in the Torah. Kotzer ruach literally means shortness of spirit. So some of the commentators say that it's physical, right? This is Rashi's comment. It literally means shortness of breath. There are other commentators, like one famously, both a medieval commentator named Sforno, but even more, the Pizanza Rebbe, who was the Eish Kodesh, who was the Rebbe of the Warsaw Ghetto, whose writings were mostly discovered after the war. He says, no, it means shortness of spirit, literally, that their souls have been crushed through the years and years and years of bondage. They have no spirit left. And he saw it around him, even in the ghetto, that people would try to carry out religious obligations, that is mitzvot, and they did it spiritlessly because they had no koach, they had no strength inside themselves because of the constant deprivations and humiliations that they were subject to. It was partly physical, but it wasn't essentially a physical thing, it was a spiritual thing. Now, the Meshech Chochmah says something that in an interesting way combines both of these and serves as the essential subject for our discussion this morning. He says, notice what God tells Moses to say. God says, tell the Israelites, I will take you out of Egypt and I will bring you to the land of Israel, the promised land. And Moses goes and says that to them and comes back and says, they can't hear me. According to the Meshech Chochmah, and what I think is a really brilliant and insightful comment, he says, had Moses said to them, I will liberate you, they would have been able to hear him. But once he started talking about the promised land, which was so far in the future, such an unimaginable achievement, something that they could not begin to conceptualize given the huge burden of slavery they bore. Once that happened, so they turned off. They couldn't hear. And in fact, the Meshech Chochmah points out that in future instructions that God gives to Moses, God doesn't talk about the promised land anymore, not for a long time. Instead, God's only speaking about the liberation because you can't envision the promised land if you're a slave. You can just envision not being a slave anymore. And in the Torah column I wrote for the Jerusalem Post, and I'm going to elaborate on all these points now, but I pointed back to what happens with Hagar and Sarah when Sarah is treating Hagar in the book of Genesis, in Bereshit, chapter 16. When Hagar has a child and Sarah is angry, or actually when she's pregnant, and Sarah is angry at her, even though Sarah wanted her to, at the time she's Sarai, but even though she wanted her to be, to give birth to Abraham's child, then when she sees her pregnant, it's not good, you can imagine. So she effectively kicks her out of the house or chases her away with her meanness. And Hagar's running away from Sarah. And the angel comes and says, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? Okay, you heard the angel's question. This is Genesis chapter 16, verse 8. Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? And she said, I am running away from my mistress Sarai. Now, you will notice that the angel has asked two questions and she has answered one. The angel said, where did you come from and where are you going? And she only says, I'm running from Sarai. And the rabbis comment here that what this teaches us is that if you are in a situation of oppression, you just want to escape. You don't actually know where you're going. You don't know what your destination is. You just want to get out of where you are. And this is also the case with the Israelites in Egypt. They don't know where the promised land is, but they know what it is to get out of Egypt. Now, this idea was something of a principle of psychology that you overburden, and this is in part the answer, I think, to what Jim is asking, which is, he said liberation first, why didn't they just hear that? You overburden someone and they start to discount what you have said before. That is, if you say to me, look, we have great sales in this store. Look at this, and the sale looks good. And then I say, look at that, and look at that, and look at that. And increasingly, they don't look so good. I'm going to look back at the first one and say, maybe it wasn't so good. That is, your credibility on your initial words wanes when your subsequent words are not serious or useful. And so I think that this idea we can see, for example, when God says to Abraham, Lech lecha, go forth. This is chapter 12 of Genesis. Leave your parents' house, your this, your that, the place where you were born, and so on, and go to the land I will show you. Doesn't specify, just says, I will show you. Because the essential nature of going somewhere is that you never know entirely what it is you will find, right? Every journey has destinations of which the traveler is unaware, said Martin Buber. And it is the very nature of exploration that you don't know where you're going to. And especially when you're in a situation of extremis, that you can't imagine what that destination will be. Now, having said that, nonetheless, as you know, God forces Moses to go to Pharaoh. Despite the fact that the Israelites don't listen to him, despite the fact that he's of impeded speech, whatever that means, kvad peh and kvad lashon, heavy of tongue, and heavy of speech, heavy of mouth, heavy of tongue, he goes to Pharaoh. And then you have the question also, which we can delve into for a second, of the psychology of a Pharaoh. So Pharaoh's psychology, remember, is shaped by his absolutism. That is, he is the complete ruler of Egypt. And it is impossible for such total control not to warp your sense of yourself. It's why ancient rulers thought of themselves as gods. What did that really mean? Well, what it meant in this world was that everybody did everything they told them to. And Moses's defiance of that seems like an extraordinary act of chutzpah, and an even foolish act of chutzpah, because how could he defy a god? And therefore, Pharaoh can't believe, I'll get to hardening his heart in a minute, but Pharaoh can't believe that what is happening to him is anything other than a trick. because otherwise there has to be a force greater than he that opposes him. And when it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, there are many, many, many different explanations of what that means. But I think that the two most I want to not obvious, but the two most plausible readings are, one, that the Torah means exactly what it says. That is, God decided that the Israelites needed to be punished. God was afraid that Pharaoh would be overawed by these plagues, and God didn't want him to. There may be moral questions about how just that is to continue to subject people to plagues if Pharaoh would have let them go. But the larger point, I think, is that God wants to make a point for all of history, and not just for today or tomorrow. And then the second idea, that is the second point, is that the other reading is that what hardening Pharaoh's heart really means is that God leads people in the direction they want to go. That is, Pharaoh wanted to be hard. His courage was failing him. God gave him enough courage to do that which he originally wanted to do. So it's like you're setting, I mean, Pharaoh in this is a sort of paradigmatic character. Pharaoh is doing what pharaohs do, and God's hardening enables Pharaoh in a certain sense to do that. So that's what you get, I think, from the hardening Pharaoh's heart and from Moses, the two principal antagonists in this story. Let's say a little bit more about the other participants, that is the Israelites and the Egyptians. The Israelites are remarkably underrepresented in the story. If you think about it, we have almost nothing about what they're thinking, what they're feeling. They're one sort of undifferentiated mass of people. And this too, I think, is the Torah's way of explaining what happens to the psychology of a human being under slavery. That is, in slavery, you don't really have a chance to feel what you would normally feel, and to have the room to maneuver and the expansiveness of thought and possibility that you would if you were living in normal conditions. And so I really, I think that the absence of the mob is deliberate to suggest to us that, yes, it took a long time for Israel to sort of come out of its shell. When it does in the desert, it's not always a pleasant result. But nonetheless, for Israel to come out of its shell and to be a people that actually can express itself in ways other than just kvetching, which Israel does well. Those of you who don't know what kvetching is, it basically means complaining. And for the Egyptians, I do want to point out that I'm going to get back to the original point at the end, the point of destinations, for a specific reason. But I do want to say something else about the psychology of the Egyptians. You don't so much, there's an outcry in Egypt, but you don't so much get the sense that the outcry is against Pharaoh as it is against the existential situation in which they find themselves. And then at the end of the slavery, when the Israelites are leaving, as you know, they despoil the Egyptians of all their goods, or much of their goods, and their commentators feel differently about that. Some think that the Egyptians willingly gave them, lovingly gave them, in the words of one commentator, he was Benno Jacob, that they lovingly gave them because they realized for how long they had oppressed people. Although I suspect that psychologically, again, is not is not that attuned. Generally, people that you mistreat, you don't like. It's not like you mistreat people and then you love them. But let's give the Egyptians the benefit of the doubt for the moment, and say that they willingly gave up their jewels to these fleeing slaves, as implausible as I confess that sounds. But the destination idea is an idea that actually, in some ways, dominates the story of the Torah. The Israelites in the desert don't know where they're going. Because they don't know where they're going, because they don't have a clear sense of destination and where it could be and what it could be, they find themselves unable to be satisfied with the duration of the journey and the hardships of the journey because of the ultimate reward. They can't believe in the promised land because they haven't seen it and they haven't lived a life that gives them the right of expectation. Instead, they've lived the life that teaches them that you don't get what you want. And so they live in the desert, not in the constant expectation they're going to step into the promised land, which, as we know, the ones who left Egypt don't do, actually, that generation dies in the desert. But also because the promised land isn't real to them, as they are, they're caught up, as people are, in the exigencies of their own situation at their own moment. Think of when you're in pain. When you're in pain, that's all that exists. The pain is so overwhelming and real, it's very hard to think of what you want way down the road. Instead, what you want is a relief from the pain. What Hagar wants is escape from Sarah. What the Israelites want is a lifting of bondage. What we want is just a vaccine. And that was the point that I was driving towards, which is all of this is a really good analogy, not that we are in slavery, God forbid, he says, as he drinks his coffee in his comfortable home. It's not that we're in slavery. Excuse me, a little coffee first. No. It's rather that when you're in a situation that is difficult, whether it is a pandemic or slavery, it is psychologically very difficult to project yourself over that situation and know what you want when you get to the other side. Instead, you just want to be out of the situation you are in. You just want this to be over. And that really is a powerful similarity that I think is important for us to keep in mind. And that teaches us that the Torah's depictions, even in those subtle ways, like the Israelites not listening to Moses, that the Torah's depiction is really is attuned to the way in which oppression, slavery, and difficulty play with and prey on the human mind. And I'm going to now just address a couple of questions that have been asked through the chat. I mean, God is playing with Pharaoh. I think that's true, displaying power and hardening his heart in order to teach the Hebrews who's who and what's what. Because as we know, no display of God's power is sufficient to convince them to listen to God through Moses. And Moses will be the subject of several rebellions and complaints and arguments and so on along the way. But that's nonetheless, that is certainly true. And I think that the entirety of the Torah can be seen in some sense as a continued attempt to educate people to trust God with both backslidings and forward movement. But this is a longer subject and one that I'm not going to enter into this morning. I just want to make 2 or 3 more comments, and then we will wrap it up for this session, and hope to see you on Shabbat morning, when we'll talk about something else in this parsha that I think is particularly interesting and worth discussing. But it's about hearts and masks. But I hope that you will join me on Shabbat morning to hear about hearts and masks. But I do want to say one other thing about this, which is that the beginning of Pharaoh's stubbornness, okay, is we see in verse 27, chapter 9, verse 27, it says, Pharaoh sent for Moses and Aaron and said to them, I stand guilty this time. The Lord's in the right. I and my people are wrong. Plead with them. And Moses does. And then it says, Vayechazek leif Paro, v'lo shalach et bnei Yisrael. And Pharaoh's heart stiffened. So the beginning of Pharaoh's heart's stiffening was with Pharaoh. And the Talmud says that God leads you in the direction you want to go. In other words, you want to be a bad person, God will lead you that way. You want to be a good person, God will lead you that way. Pharaoh wants to be a stubborn person, God will lead Pharaoh that way. God will exaggerate the qualities that we already privilege. And this vignette, this short ending of chapter 9, illustrates that, I think, very clearly. And part of it is Pharaoh, too, could not envision the end game. Pharaoh wanted to get out of the distress of the moment, but did not realize what was happening. It's very hard to see the threads of what will happen in the future when you're caught up in the present. The future is unknown and unpredictable anyway, but especially when you're in any kind of distress, it's very difficult. So vaccines are coming. Distress will be relieved, God willing. But life, of course, is full of all kinds of distress. There are distresses other than pandemics. And it is worth keeping this in mind, that in a moment of distress, we may not be able to make the long-term plan that we hope for, but that the distress will ease, the time will come, and the Israelites, in another week, will be liberated. So hope to see you then, and Shabbat Shalom. Take care of yourself and stay safe.